Covers. So, we are doing our next topic in our society PowerPoint uh, that is on the media. So, the media is a huge part of civil society. So, whenever you think of civil society and NGOs, don't forget to think about the media. So, the role of the media really is to protect civil liberties because they watch government and report on the happenings of government, among other topics. So, both democratic and authoritarian regimes do impose some limits and constraints on the media, basically to protect the citizen and maintain order. So, in some democratic regimes, some limitations include, like, for example, the BBC, that they can't get any advertising money from candidates during elections, right? Because that's not objective. So there are some limitations based on democratic and liberal democracies, but then there are also authoritarian regimes that do impose constraints, like the Chinese firewall. So there are limits. Both democratic and authoritarian regimes do place limits on the media. Democratic regimes generally tolerate a high degree of media freedom. So, defining media freedom is the ability to investigate government, it's the ability to investigate citizens, it's the ability to report on protests, the ability to get documents through the Freedom of Information Act, like in the United States, from government. So, to have free media means that the media is not necessarily bound and constrained to do its job in reporting. So, free media freedom. And to encourage citizen control of the public agenda. So, really, the media is intended to be the voice of the people. So, if there is um, any issues that citizens want to know about, usually, if they don't research it themselves, citizens usually get that information from the media. And so the media is a third watchdog. It's a check on political power and political corruption. So it is a watchdog. Okay, stronger authoritarian regimes monitor and restrict citizens' media access to a greater extent to maintain control. So in authoritarian regimes, um, control and peace is perhaps more important than individual liberty. So maintaining um, some political control is more important than individual liberty. All right, and a government is transparent. That's a term you can use, transparency, when it allows information about government and policy making to circulate openly. So usually, and that's the thing about, liberal democracies, they work with media because oftentimes the media is how most citizens get their information. So the media relies on government transparency. So when there's something happening in government, some policy, then the media is there to ask the questions. The media is there to report to the American citizen. So, in a healthy democracy, government and media do collaborate, although they are in opposition because the media is watching the government, and at the same time, the government is supposed to deliver media freedom so that the message can be brought to the people in an objective way. All right, authoritarian regimes tend to prefer secret or closed proceedings to maximize order. So, again, order is more important than individual liberty to many authoritarian regimes, so their level of transparency may be very limited. All right, so let's start with the UK. So, this is our best example of open and free media. So, they are very investigative. They're free and open. They can question the government. The government does respond to the media. Um, the biggest media outlet is the BBC. And I'll try and give you examples of major media in each of our countries so you can refer to it by name. So the BBC is actually subsidized by the government. It does charge to citizens a tax. It's a license tax charged to anyone who owns a television or gets television service. So that money goes to partially, in part, funds the BBC. The BBC is also private in a sense that it does have to generate its own income, so it's partially subsidized by the state. But even though there is some degree of state control over the BBC has a history of being a watchdog and is not afraid to criticize government. An example was when Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister in the 1990s, I'm sorry, he was Prime Minister in the 1990s, but this was in the 2000s when he is going to support George W. Bush's war in Iraq, which was highly unpopular in the UK, and so the BBC did criticize the Prime Minister. Um, the BBC was actually created during the era of collective consensus, and that's when both political parties in the UK worked together in the time 1950s, 1960s, where they were recovering from World War II. So they collectively agreed to work together, and so uh, the British broadcasting originated during that time, and it was monopolized as a public service to the citizens, right? Because oftentimes news organizations are not highly profitable because they're supposed to be a public service, which is why the BBC is subsidized by the state. There are limits on the BBC, like, for example, the government has limited the BBC in a sense that to keep them relatively objective. For example, no advertisements may be sold to politicians, parties, or political causes on the BBC. And you may recall the Jordan Klepper video we saw about how the only way that politicians do ads is on like billboards. And there are private companies in addition to the BBC that do operate newspapers, The Guardian, and other types of news organizations that do operate in the UK. Speaking of various types of publications, there are tabloids. That's another very sensationalized form of media. You can kind of see here what a tabloid may look like as opposed to what a serious journalistic paper would look like. And it tends to be class divided. Working class tends to indulge in the tabloids, where more of the middle and upper crust tend to go more of the scholarly. So the government has continued to support the BBC. There is a license fee levied on any household in Britain with a television and receives broadcast. Russia. So Russia's government basically has nationalized most of their media. So nationalization, is that government owns it. Government owns that company and has placed rigid controls on any kind of opposition to the government. So it is essentially a state-run media. No investigative journalism is essentially allowed, especially investigating Putin or the government. As a matter of fact, when Putin first came into office, there was a media oligarch. His name was Berezovsky. And so he became an oligarch under Yeltsin. And when Putin came in and basically tried to control the oligarchs, they said, look, this was a deal that Putin made with the oligarchs. You stay out of government business, and I will allow you to continue to be your oligarch and be wildly rich. However, Boris Berezovsky, as a media oligarch, did criticize Putin and did do investigations on Putin, and Putin had him arrested. I think he served 10 years in jail, and to this day he is been exiled. And the state, the government, took control of the news station that Berezovsky was an oligarch of and named it Channel 1. So Channel 1 is the main state-run broadcast of Russia. Private newspapers are widely available and tend to be more critical of the government, but they have been silenced, usually through harassment or assassination. Example, was a female journalist who was covering the Chechen War. Her name is, and forgive my pronunciation, Politkovskaya. And she was murdered covering the Chechen War, exposing the human rights violations committed by the Russians. Another example of a journalist targeted by Russian government is Karamuza. Remember, he was the guy who got poisoned twice, once in 2015 and once in 2017. All right, so Russian media is highly censored. Speaking of highly censored, let's go to China. So, the Chinese Communist Party uses what is often referred to as the Great Firewall to limit political criticism on social media. So, if you go on the internet in China, there are firewalls left and right. You can barely get access to anything. So, basically, the internet is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So, it's not just news organizations, but the internet is controlled by Chinese Communist Party. It does have complete state-run media. Um, at least from 1949 to 1980. Remember, that's the Communist Revolution to Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping opened things up a little bit. And so now there is some independence, but I will tell you, far and large, state run media outlets still hold the greatest share of the market. So, an example of state run media is, and again, forgive the pronunciation, Gi and Hao. Gi and Hao is the largest station and is huge, employing more than 10,000 people who are stationed not only in China but abroad as well. All right, let's go to Mexico. So, Mexico, since the loss of the PRR dominance, has become increasingly more independent. So, realize, just like every other topic, Mexico is democratizing and in transition. So, the news media are subject to a variety of mainly indirect economic and political pressures from the government. But I will tell you the largest pressure that the media finds itself in is against organized crime and the drug cartels. As a matter of fact, Reporters Without Borders, which is an NGO, is going to it reported that Mexico is the one of the world's most dangerous countries for journalists and media workers. It says most of these crimes go unpunished. So, whenever there's bad coverage, you can see here from the photo of drug cartels or due to a history of corruption in government, there is some loss of independence. So it is becoming more independent, but again, it is transitioning. The Constitution of 1917, which is the Mexican Constitution, explicitly guarantees freedom of press, but in practice, the government tolerance of freedoms varies according to the sensitivities of the president. So realize that a remnant of the PRI and a remnant of Mexican history is that the Constitution does give unusually large amounts of power to the executive. Now, the executive can only serve 6 years, sexentia, but it is a lot of power. And historically, these strongmen, right? These Mexican presidents have been authoritarians. It's really since 2000 that we started to see that presidents have been a little bit more in check because of the loss of the dominance of the PRI. So again, as a result of the presidents becoming more in check, media is being allowed to be more independent. So we'll see what happens as Mexico moves into the future. All right, Nigeria. So Nigeria, technically, is a free and independent press. They have freedom of information, all that kind of stuff. The the Nigerian Constitution, the 1999 Constitution, does guarantee free speech and free press. So it is also transitioning after a history of being suppressed. For example, during the remember how Nigeria is broken up? Well, you'll find this out tomorrow because this is what we are going to be talking about, this political culture. That Nigeria's history is broken up into four republics, and it's in the fourth republic right now, and it's trying to become more independent. But in its previous republics, media had been, under military dictatorships, had been suppressed. So, for example, 1994, General Abacha, cracked down on media opposition by closing several newspapers and magazines. Um, but again, we are starting to see in the Fourth Republic, since the past administration under Buhari, we've been seeing some opening up of the media. Press does reflect ethnic divisions in the country, like in the South and in the cities. Um, Press is pretty strong. A lot of newspaper coverage, a lot of newspapers. But in the rural North, it's a lot more limited. So the main source of information Nigeria's can get is through radio. All 36 states within Nigeria have their own radio stations. And because of their long history of being a British colony, a lot of their media is associated with England or with the Brits. So the BBC operates heavily in Nigeria. So does the Guardian, which is a British newspaper. But the New York Times and CNN also broadcast there. Internet access, about 60% have internet access, but cell phone access is much higher at 80%. Iran. So the Iranians' courts have a history of revoking media licenses when a jury finds that the owners of the media, of that media outlet, guilty of publishing anti-religious material or information detrimental to the national interest. So there is heavy censorship. If you speak against the government or against Islam, well, you could be threatened with having your license revoked. So heavy censorship. 80% of Iranians get their news from state-run media, and the biggest state-run media is IRIB, Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting. But there are many newspapers and magazines that are privately owned, and Iranian press has more freedom than perhaps other Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia or Yemen. Um, but that the bar is low there, right? So the bar is low, and this is because Iran, unlike the rest of the Middle East, does have an extremely high level of education. Remember, they've had a strong history of being more Western. Journalists are often jailed, uh, more often jailed than other Middle Eastern countries, according to Reporters Without Borders, and that's because there's a slight degree of freedom, so they're jailed, as opposed to the intense scrutiny placed on media by other Middle Eastern countries. Alrighty, so that ends media. We're going to go to our final topic tomorrow. It will probably take 2 videos to do it, and then we'll be finished with society. Alright, have a good weekend, guys.